So to finish off the Minoans here, it's worth taking a look at it's a site that is not on Crete, but it's in fact on one of these small islands in the Aegean, so just north of Crete. You can see it there on the map. The island is known as Thira, Thira, or Santorini today. And this is what we can kind of call a Minoan colony. So it's not very, very clear exactly what the nature of the Minoan presence is. There are clearly Minoans on this island, and we look at some of the wall paintings that are very comparable to what we see on Crete. What remains today is actually the after effect of a volcanic eruption. So you can see on the little map there on the lower left, the red part of that outline. That's what the island used to look like. It used to be a circular island, and then that middle part is where the volcano is. It erupted, and the entire thing collapsed into the sea. So what we're looking at here is the caldera. That's that gap that's left behind, and you can make out the difference, the tephra and the volcanic ash from the actual eruption. Santorini today is a very popular island to visit, definitely worth a visit, very, very beautiful, and you can see how the entire town is built on the uppermost crust of the actual island, literally just off of the caldera there. There are three islands, Thracia, Thera, and Aspronisi, that are all part of this kind of group here. And when you actually, if you visit the main part of the island, you can actually take a boat that'll take you out to the part that is the volcanic part. Here is one of these very many holes that actually release sulfur gases. So you have that sort of egg smell, and they leave a sort of a yellowish hue on the actual rock. So it's still an active volcano. There are some views of that caldera of the actual, you see the beautiful rock of the island. And there's an aerial view, and you can very clearly make out here what would have been the volcano in the middle that actually caused that collapse all around it. The last small eruption was in 1950, and that was captured there in the photograph. So potentially something could happen again in the near future. Now the actual site we're interested is a site called Akrotiri, and it's just, it's a small site on the actual island. It's covered underneath, what you see there on the left, a metal roof, and it's a huge settlement with very, very elaborately built houses, mansions. Many have been explored, around 10 of them, but there are actually many, many more that still need to be excavated. It has a sort of a town planning where it has a long north-south street, and then you have basically houses on either side of it. The houses are 2, even 3 stories high. They have indoor staircases. They are comparable to some of the stuff we might have seen on Crete. They have features of Minoan architecture, and they also have walls that are decorated very similarly to the Minoan frescoes that we've seen on Knossos. It was discovered and excavated initially by a guy by the name of Spiridon Marinatos, and then it was excavated and is still actively an archaeological project by a professor by the name of Christos Dumas. Now, the actual site was essentially abandoned, so what they found was basically just vases stacked up together in storage rooms, basements full of objects. You can see the damage here from the stairs. That is actually earthquake damage, so potentially we're talking about volcanic eruptions, but also before the volcanic eruption, potentially smaller earthquakes that would have caused some damage to the site. You can see parts of the preserved walls up to 3 stories, and it's significant because of the volcano actually covered it up that we actually have Minoan architecture that survives. On Crete, we don't have such buildings survive. What we looked at Knossos was, remember, Evans reconstructions, not the actual 3 stories that were preserved from antiquity. So it's significant that we have this. It would be the equivalent of Pompeii in Italy, that was preserved under Mount Vesuvius' eruption. Here are the multiple pumice layers from that eruption. And then here we have some of the basement rooms, just to show you how it was actually left intact, abandoned essentially. And we'll look at that wall painting in the background right there. Even some rooms still had plaster that was going to be applied onto the walls. So no human bodies have been found, so the people were able to evacuate the island before the major eruption that ended up leaving it completely covered up. Now, lots of buildings Zesty 3 is the more complicated one, and it was 3 stories, and it has multiple frescoes throughout the entire space. You can see this is a plan, a pull-out plan that actually shows you all different frescoes. This one here we're going to look at is on the upper sort of left section there. It is called the Saffron Gatherers, and what we have is a group of young women that are gathering saffron from a field of crocus flowers. Many believe that because these young girls have this what looks like a blue head, that the blue is in fact an indication of a shaved head, and Minoan artists often did that to show a young adolescent. So it's possible that the saffron that's being gathered here is actually a painkiller and would be in fact used for menstrual cramps as these young girls come of age. So it could be a scene of some sort of coming of age for young women. Here they are presenting the basket full of the saffron flowers to a goddess or a priestess who sits in front of it, and she has a griffin figure in front of her, so kind of a mythical scene. But if you might recall some of the Minoan wall paintings we saw on Crete, they're very similar style, very similar type figures. And you can see here all the great efforts that go into reconstructing these piece by piece to create the actual frescoes. The other main area is the West House, and this has a lot of frescoes as well. And it has one particular fresco that goes around the room, and you can see here a reconstruction of it, showing it on the very, very top there. And it's referred to as the miniature ship or flotilla fresco. And it's basically 2 towns, one on either end, and you can kind of make it out there in the upper left. And it basically has a series of boats that are voyaging from one side to the other. It's thought to be Akrotiri that we're looking at, and the actual fleet's home port, sailing or heading off to a different port somewhere else. You can see some close-ups here of the buildings, the multiple story buildings, like what we actually see in Santorini. And you can see some close-ups here of the arrival town they're going to. Now it's not clear where they're going to. It could be an indication of a group from Santorini sailing to Crete, or it could be somewhere else entirely. But it's actually nice because we actually have these paintings of Minoan buildings, and we actually have a couple of examples. They're called town mosaics. They're little plaques made out of faience and ivory that represent Minoan buildings, and they sort of match to the images that we have at Akrotiri from the frescoes, as well as the buildings that actually survive at Akrotiri underneath the pumice layers from the eruption. One of the famous frescoes is this one, and it's the famous spring fresco from another building called Delta 2, and it shows the Minoan landscape. So that reddish bluish hue that you see in the bottom there is in fact what Santorini looks like. And this is a picture here on the right of an actual roadside image that has that mixture of red and bluish kind of hue. And then above, growing out of that rock, out of that soil, are the famous lilies of Santorini. This is a motif that is common on the island's artwork, as are those birds, these 2 sparrows that are flying. And you can see a close-up there of these birds. They are in the midst of feeding. So the top one is actually dropping what would be equivalent of dropping food into the mouth of the lower one. You notice how the lower one's feet are visible to the actual image. So we're seeing the bird turned sort of upside down as it's flying. And just to show you another example of the same bird on a motif used on the island. Now, as I said, this motif is very common on Santorini, and one of the big questions for this island is what happened to these inhabitants? Where did they go after they abandoned the island? Now, because they're Minoan in character, we don't expect them to sort of settle down and leave something very, very different than what would be typical Minoan. So if they went to Crete and they settled down there, they would probably blend in with local culture because they are in fact Minoans themselves. The one thing that scholars have looked for are these birds, because these birds are typical of this island. So you would think that if they would actually move to Crete, that they would take this motif that is common for them and actually start depicting it on their artworks there. But nothing like that has actually been discovered yet.